The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut, echoing over the anxious murmurs of the stunned crowd. Pinned against the hood of a scarred police cruiser was a man in a bespoke navy suit, his cheek pressed against the freezing metal. The arresting officer smirked to the onlookers, entirely unaware that the man he was humiliating was not just some local troublemaker. He stood on the cusp of taking a seat on the United States Supreme Court. That single arrest would destroy the officer's entire life. The air in Georgetown was crisp, the kind of brisk autumn day in Washington, D.C., that carried the scent of fallen leaves and expensive espresso. Elias Voss stepped out of the artisanal coffee shop on M Street, a steaming black coffee in his hand. He carried himself with an inherent quiet dignity, a man who had spent his entire life measuring his words and his steps. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, an overcoat draped neatly over his arm, and a silk tie perfectly knotted at his collar. He had been living in a whirlwind. As a highly respected judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, he had just been announced as the president's nominee to fill the vacant seat on the United States Supreme Court. His face had been on the front page of the Washington Post and the New York Times. But without the sharp lighting of a television studio and the robes of his office, to some he was just another man walking down the street. To Officer Trent Harlon, he was a target. Officer Harlon was a veteran of the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, a man composed entirely of rigid biases and unchecked authority. He had a reputation in the precinct, one whispered about in locker rooms, but never formally challenged, for aggressively policing the affluent neighborhoods, ensuring that anyone who did not belong was heavily scrutinized. For years, he had hidden his prejudice behind a badge, justifying his racial profiling with the thin excuse of proactive policing. The police radio in Harlan's cruiser had crackled moments earlier with a dispatch call. A burglary had occurred in a high-end townhouse 3 blocks away. The suspect description was agonizingly vague. A black male estimated to be in his late 20s, wearing dark sweatpants and a gray hooded sweatshirt, last seen fleeing on foot. Elias Voss was nearly 60. He was wearing a 3-piece suit that cost more than Harlan made in a month. He was walking at a leisurely pace, sipping a macchiato. By absolutely no metric of logic, law, or common sense did Elias match the description of the fleeing suspect. But as Harlan cruised down M Street in his patrol car, his eyes locked onto Elias. Harlan did not see a federal judge. He did not see a Supreme Court nominee. He saw a black man in a predominantly wealthy white neighborhood. And in Harlan's twisted worldview, that was enough to constitute reasonable suspicion. Harlan abruptly wrenched the steering wheel, pulling his cruiser onto the curb, the tires screeching loudly against the concrete. The sudden noise startled a flock of pigeons and drew the immediate attention of the pedestrians enjoying their morning stroll. Harlan threw open the door, stepping out with his hand resting heavily on his utility belt, puffing his chest out as he approached the judge. "Hey, you there! Stop walking!" Harlan barked, his voice echoing loudly across the busy sidewalk. Elias paused. He looked around, genuinely believing the officer must be speaking to someone else behind him. When he realized Harlan was glaring directly at him, Elias calmly took a sip of his coffee and turned to face the officer. "Can I help you, officer?" Elias asked. His voice was a rich, deep baritone, the exact same voice that had commanded respect in federal courtrooms for over 2 decades. There was no fear in his tone, only a mild, polite curiosity. "I said stop walking. Put the coffee down on the hood of my car and show me your hands," Harlan commanded, closing the distance between them. Elias's brow furrowed slightly. He was an expert in constitutional law. He knew the parameters of Terry versus Ohio like the back of his hand. He knew what constituted an investigatory stop and what constituted a violation of the Fourth Amendment. "Officer, I am perfectly happy to speak with you," Elias said, his voice remaining level, lowering the coffee cup to his side. "But I would like to know why I am being stopped. Have I committed a traffic infraction on foot?" Harlan's face flushed red. He despised being questioned, especially by the people he deemed beneath his authority. "I don't need to explain myself to you. We have a report of a robbery in this area. You match the description of the suspect. Now put the cup down and give me your ID." Elias sighed internally. The reality of his skin color overriding his tailored suit and his graying hair was a tragedy he had faced before, though not in many years. "Officer, unless the suspect was described as a nearly 60-year-old man in a charcoal suit, I highly doubt I match the description of a fleeing burglar. Furthermore, I left my wallet and my briefcase at my office. I just stepped out for a coffee." No ID. Harlan's eyes narrowed into malicious slits. To him, this was the golden ticket. No ID, evasive behavior, refusing a lawful order. "Put your hands on the hood of the car." The atmosphere on the street had shifted dramatically. Pedestrians had stopped walking. A few people pulled out their smartphones, the camera lenses reflecting the morning sun as they began to record the interaction. Elias noticed the crowd gathering. He knew that any sudden movement, any display of anger, would be weaponized against him. "Officer," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave, radiating absolute authority, "I am not refusing a lawful order because your order is not lawful. You lack reasonable, articulable suspicion to detain me. If you insist on pressing this matter, I strongly suggest you call your watch commander to this location." Harlan scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think you're a lawyer or something? You think you can talk your way out of this? I'm the law out here." "I don't think I'm a lawyer," Elias replied calmly. "I know exactly what I am. And I am asking you, for your own sake, to step back and assess this situation." The calmness in Elias's voice infuriated Harlan more than screaming would have. Harlan wanted submission. He wanted fear. The absolute lack of intimidation in Elias's eyes felt like an insult to Harlan's badge. Without another word, Harlan lunged forward. He grabbed Elias roughly by the shoulder of his expensive coat, spinning him around with brute force. Elias's coffee tumbled to the pavement, the hot liquid splashing across his polished leather shoes, shattering the ceramic cup. Gasps erupted from the crowd. "Hey, what are you doing to him?" a woman shouted from the patio of the coffee shop. "Get back! Police business!" Harlan roared at the crowd, shoving Elias hard against the hood of the cruiser. The metal was freezing against Elias's cheek. "Spread your legs!" Harlan shouted, kicking Elias's ankle aggressively to force his stance wider. Elias did not resist physically, but he did not stay silent. "Officer, you are committing a false arrest. You are engaging in battery under color of law. You are violating my civil rights, and you are doing it in front of a dozen cameras." "Shut your mouth," Harlan snarled, yanking Elias's arms behind his back with unnecessary violence. He unclipped his handcuffs. The sound was sharp in the cold air. Click. Click. The cold steel bit into Elias's wrists, tightened just a fraction too much to ensure maximum discomfort. Harlan patted Elias down aggressively, finding nothing but a cell phone and a money clip holding a $50 bill. No weapons, no stolen jewelry, nothing. But Harlan was too deep in his own pride to back down now. He had made a scene, and he had to justify it. "You're under arrest for resisting a police officer, failure to identify, and obstruction of justice," Harlan declared loudly, ensuring the crowd heard him. "I did not resist, and failure to identify without secondary cause in this jurisdiction is not an arrestable offense," Elias stated, his face still pressed to the hood. "You are destroying your career right now, officer." "My career is just fine, tough guy," Harlan sneered, grabbing Elias by the collar and shoving him toward the back door of the cruiser. He pressed his hand hard on top of Elias's head, forcing him down into the cramped back seat of the vehicle, slamming the door shut with a triumphant thud. Harlon turned to the crowd, pointing a finger. "Show's over. Move along." Inside the cruiser, Elias sat in the claustrophobic space behind the plexiglass divider. His wrists throbbed. The smell of stale sweat and cheap vinyl filled his nose. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, controlling his heart rate. He felt a profound, aching sadness, not for himself, but for the countless young men who looked like him, who did not have his legal knowledge, who did not have his power, and who ended up in the back of cars like this every single day, with no hope of justice. Harlon climbed into the driver's seat, whistling a cheerful Ami off-key tune. He adjusted his rearview mirror to look at his prisoner. "You should have just shown me your ID, pal," Harlon mocked. "Now you're going to spend the weekend in lockup." Elias opened his eyes, meeting Harlon's gaze in the mirror. His expression was as cold and unyielding as granite. "I suggest you drive it to your precinct, officer," Elias said softly, "because when we get there, the world as you know it is going to come to a very abrupt end." The drive to the 2nd District Police Station was short, but Harlon spent the entire time attempting to verbally demean his passenger. He bragged about how many smart guys he had locked up, how the streets belonged to him. Elias did not say a single word in response. He stared out the window, calculating his exact next moves. When the cruiser pulled into the precinct's rear sally port, Harlon hauled Elias out of the back seat by his arm, dragging him toward the heavy steel doors of the booking area. The precinct was bustling with the morning shift change. Uniformed officers were drinking terrible coffee from styrofoam cups. Paperwork was being shuffled, and the low hum of police radios filled the air. Desk Sergeant Oswald Quinn, a grizzled veteran with a strict adherence to procedure, was sitting behind the high wooden desk. "Look what I dragged in, Quinn," Harlon announced loudly, marching Elias into the center of the room. "Caught this one casing houses over on M Street. Matched the description of a burglary suspect. Gave me lip. Refused to identify. Resisted." Sergeant Quinn looked up from his monitor. He looked at the suspect. He saw a man in a ruined high-end suit, standing with perfect posture despite the cuffs behind his back. There was something intensely familiar about the man's face. Quinn narrowed his eyes, a strange sense of unease washing over him. "All right, Harlon. Bring him to the counter," Quinn said slowly. Harlon shoved Elias forward. "Empty your pockets. Oh, wait, you can't. You're cuffed." Harlon laughed at his own joke, reaching into Elias's coat pocket and tossing the money clip and the sleek cell phone onto the desk. "Name?" Sergeant Quinn asked, looking directly at Elias. Elias looked up at the desk sergeant. "My name is Elias Voss." Quinn's fingers hovered over his keyboard. He knew that name. He had just heard that name on the morning news while driving to work. He stared at Elias's face again. The graying temples, the sharp jawline, the piercing intelligent eyes. Suddenly the color drained entirely from Sergeant Quinn's face. His stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. He looked from Elias to Harlon, who was leaning against the counter, looking unbearably smug. "Harlon," Quinn whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Where did you pick him up?" "M Street, like I said. Matched the description of the kid who broke into the townhouse." The suspect in that call was described as 25 years old, wearing a hoodie, Harlon, Quinn said, his voice rising in panic. "This man is wearing a suit." "He's a suspect, Quinn. Process him," Harlon snapped, annoyed by the pushback. "Officer Harlon," Elias spoke up, his voice cutting through the noise of the precinct like a razor blade. The entire room seemed to quiet down as the deep, commanding tone commanded their attention. "You arrested me without probable cause. You assaulted me. You deprived me of my liberty under the color of law. Sergeant, I would like my phone. I have to make a call." "You don't get a phone call until you're processed," Harlon yelled. stepping toward Elias. "Step back, Harlon!" Quinn barked, standing up so fast his chair rolled and slammed against the back wall. The sudden aggression from the desk sergeant shocked the entire room into absolute silence. Every officer turned to look. Quinn reached over the counter with shaking hands, grabbed Elias's phone, and gently placed it near Elias's hands. "Sir, Judge Voss, I am so sorry. Harlon froze, his mind short-circuiting. "Judge, what are you talking about? Quinn, he's a perp." Quinn ignored Harlon completely. He rushed out from behind the desk, pulling a set of handcuff keys from his belt. "Turn around, Your Honor. Please. Wait. Quinn, what are you doing?" Harlon shouted, stepping forward. "Shut up, Harlon," Quinn roared, his face red with terror. "Shut your damn mouth before you make this any worse!" Quinn unlocked the cuffs. The heavy metal fell away. Elias slowly brought his arms forward, rubbing his wrists where deep red indentations had formed. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, then picked up his phone from the desk. Harlon was staring in disbelief. "Quinn, what the hell is going on?" A younger officer near the back of the room who had been staring at his phone suddenly stood up. "Holy hell. Officer Harlon, that's the president's nominee for the Supreme Court. It's Elias Voss. He's a federal judge." The silence in the room became suffocating. It was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Harlan's smug expression dissolved, replaced by a pale, sickening horror. His eyes darted to Elias, then to Quinn, then back to Elias. The reality of what he had done crashed into him with the force of a freight train. He had not just profiled a random citizen. He had brutally arrested one of the most powerful legal figures in the United States of America. Elias did not look at Harlon. He calmly unlocked his phone and dialed a number. He put the phone to his ear, his eyes finally locking onto Harlan's terrified face. "Yes, it's Voss," Elias said into the phone, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the police station. "I need you to contact the Department of Justice, the FBI Civil Rights Division, and the mayor's office. Tell them I am currently at the 2nd District Precinct." Elias paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked directly through Officer Harlan's soul. "Tell them I was just arrested, and tell them I am pressing federal charges." The precinct was a vacuum of sound, save for the ragged, uneven breathing of Officer Trent Harlon. The words "federal charges" hung in the stale air of the station like a guillotine waiting to drop. Elias Voss ended the call and placed his phone deliberately on the wooden counter. He did not yell. He did not gloat. He simply stood there. A man whose tailored charcoal suit was stained with spilled coffee and wrinkled from the brutal treatment against a police cruiser, radiating a terrifying absolute authority. Sergeant Oswald Quinn was sweating profusely, his hands trembling as he shoved the handcuff keys back into his belt. "Your Honor, can I get you a chair, some water?" "Water, a medic." "I require nothing from you, Sergeant, other than the preservation of all surveillance and body camera footage from the last 45 minutes, Elias replied, his voice chillingly calm. "I suggest you secure it immediately." Harlon, who had been paralyzed by shock, suddenly snapped into a frantic, animalistic state of self-preservation. His mind, usually slow and clouded by arrogance, raced with terrifying clarity. He knew protocol. He knew how the system worked. If the body camera footage and the cruiser's dash cam video made it into the hands of the FBI, his career was over. If they proved he had no probable cause, he would not just be fired. He would be federally indicted for civil rights violations. "Quinn, wait," Harlon stammered, stepping toward the desk, his face a mask of desperate panic. "Look, we can fix this. I made a mistake, a bad ID. It happens. Let me just go right up the release paperwork. No harm, no foul, right? Judge, a misunderstanding." Elias Bell turned his head to look at Harlon. The look in the judge's eyes was so utterly devoid of sympathy that Harlon took an involuntary step backward. "There is no we, Officer Harlon," Elias said, enunciating every syllable. And this was not a misunderstanding. This was the arrogant application of unchecked power. You saw a black man in a wealthy neighborhood, and you decided the Constitution did not apply. You are not writing any paperwork. You are going to stand right there until the authorities arrive. But Harlon could not stand there. The walls were closing in. He backed away toward the rear hallway leading to the precinct server and evidence rooms. I need to use the restroom," Harlon muttered, turning and practically sprinting down the corridor. Quinn reached for his radio. "Harlon, get back here!" But Harlon was already gone. He burst through the swinging doors of the locker room, bypassing the restrooms entirely, and headed straight for the tech hub where the Axon body camera docks were located. His hands were shaking violently as he unclipped the camera from his chest. He knew that the footage automatically uploaded to the cloud once docked, but there was a brief window where a commanding officer or someone with the right administrative password could flag a video as accidental recording or training and permanently delete it before the sync completed. Harlon had watched his former shift lieutenant do it 2 years earlier to cover up an excessive force complaint. He had memorized the override password. He slammed the camera into the docking bay. The green light began to blink, indicating the sync had started. Harlon threw himself into the rolling chair in front of the administrative terminal, his thick fingers aggressively hammering the keyboard. He typed in the lieutenant's old credentials. Access granted. Sweat dripped from Harlon's nose onto the keyboard. He navigated to the active uploads folder, frantically searching for his badge number. There it was, a 12-minute video file. The file that contained him assaulting a federal judge and Supreme Court nominee. His cursor hovered over the delete file icon. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. All he had to do was click it. It would not save him completely. There were civilian cell phones out there, but it would destroy the crisp, high-definition audio and video from his own chest that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Elias had never resisted. He pressed his finger down on the mouse. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Harlon gasped, spinning around in the chair. Standing in the doorway of the tech room was Captain Baxter Crow, the precinct commander. Crow was a hard-nosed, strictly by-the-book leader who had been in his office upstairs when the chaotic murmurs from the bullpen reached him. Next to Crow stood 2 men in immaculate dark suits, their FBI badges already clipped to their belts. "Captain," Harlon choked out, his hand flying off the mouse as if it had caught fire. I was logging my evidence." "Step away from the terminal, Officer Harlon," Captain Crow ordered, his voice laced with a lethal mixture of fury and disgust. Special Agent Sterling Kane, a senior investigator with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, stepped into the room. The response time had been practically instantaneous. When a federal judge slated for the highest court in the land makes a distress call, the full weight of the federal government moves at lightning speed. Kane walked past Harlon without even looking at him, glancing at the computer monitor. He was in the administrative deletion queue, Captain, attempting to destroy evidence of a federal crime. Crow closed his eyes for a brief second, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He had spent years trying to clean up the reputation of the 2nd District, and in 15 minutes, Kenneth Foley, Trent Harlon, had just burned it to the ground. "Officer Trent Harlon," Captain Crow said, his voice dropping into an icy register. "You are hereby stripped of your police powers effective immediately. Surrender your weapon, your badge, and your radio." "Captain, please," Harlon begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "It was a mistake. He matched the description. You know me. I'm a good cop. I was just being proactive." "You arrested Judge Elias Voss, you absolute imbecile!" Crow shouted, finally losing his composure, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You assaulted the president's nominee for the United States Supreme Court. And then you came back here to destroy federal evidence. Hand over your weapon, or these agents will put you on the floor and take it from you." Trembling, Harlon unholstered his service weapon and placed it on the desk. He unpinned his badge, the badge he had hidden behind for 15 years, and set it next to the gun. Special Agent Kane pulled a pair of heavy federal handcuffs from his belt. "Trent Harlon, you are under arrest for the deprivation of rights under color of law and tampering with evidence in a federal investigation. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." As the cold steel clicked around Harlon's wrists, a brutal, poetic reversal of the morning's events, he realized with sickening clarity that there was no union rep, no sympathetic judge, and no blue wall of silence that could save him now. By early afternoon, the world had exploded. The cell phone video recorded by the woman at the coffee shop had been uploaded to social media. Within minutes, it had 1 million views. Soon, it was playing on a continuous loop on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC. The visual was devastating. Elias Voss, a man of impeccable character, standing calmly in his tailored suit, being violently shoved against a police cruiser by a red-faced, screaming Officer Harlon. The audio of Elias warning Harlon that he was committing a false arrest, followed by Harlon's arrogant, dismissive sneer, sent shockwaves through the nation. At the White House, the press secretary held an emergency briefing condemning the arrest in the strongest possible terms and confirming that the president had spoken with Judge Voss to offer his full support. But the true storm was brewing at the D.C. Metropolitan Police Headquarters. Mayor Celeste Harlow and Police Chief Damon Reed were standing behind a podium, in a room packed with screaming reporters. The flashbulbs were blinding. Chief Reed, sweating under the intense lights, gripped the edges of the podium. "The actions taken by former Officer Trent Harlon do not represent the values of this department," Chief Reed stated, reading from a hastily prepared statement. "Harlon has been terminated effective immediately, and we are cooperating fully with the Department of Justice in their criminal investigation." "Chief Reed," a reporter from the Washington Post shouted over the din, "Officer Harlon had 14 excessive force complaints on his record prior to today. Why was he still on the streets patrolling?" Reed swallowed hard. "Those complaints were investigated internally, and at the time were deemed inconclusive. Because the victims didn't have the power of a federal judge to fight back," another reporter fired back. Meanwhile, inside a bleak interrogation room at the FBI Washington field office, Trent Harlon sat across from his union representative, Patrick Kellerman. Harlon was in an orange holding jumper, his arrogance entirely evaporated, replaced by the terrified realization of a man staring down a decade in federal prison. "Patrick, you've got to help me," Harlon pleaded, leaning over the metal table. "The union has a defense fund. We can spin this. We can say I was hyper-focused on the burglary call. Tunnel vision. It's a recognized psychological phenomenon in high-stress policing." Kellerman, a veteran cop who usually fought tooth and nail for his members, just stared at Harlon with a mixture of pity and utter contempt. He slowly closed his legal pad. "Ken." "Trent, I'm here as a courtesy, that's it," Kellerman said flatly. "What do you mean?" Harlon demanded, panic rising in his throat. "I mean the Fraternal Order of Police is not funding your defense," Kellerman said, his voice cold. "I mean, I got off the phone with the union president 10 minutes ago. We are publicly disavowing you. You didn't just cross the line, Trent. You assaulted a federal judge on camera and then tried to delete the evidence while the FBI was in the building. You are radioactive. You are entirely on your own." Harlon slumped back in his chair, the oxygen leaving his lungs. "They can't do that. I pay my dues. Your career is over, Trent. The only question now is how much of your life you're going to spend at Leavenworth." Kellerman stood up and walked out of the room, letting the heavy steel door slam shut, leaving Harlon in total isolation. While Harlon sat in a cell, Elias Voss was holding court of a different kind. Elias had returned to his private chambers at the federal courthouse. He had changed into a fresh suit. Sitting across from him was Lila Monroe, one of the most ruthless and brilliant civil rights attorneys in the country. The mayor's office just called, offering a massive, quiet settlement, Lila said, scrolling through her phone. 7 figures. They want you to sign an NDA and make this go away before your confirmation hearings begin. They're terrified this is going to turn into a referendum on systemic policing issues. Elias stood up and walked over to his large window, looking out over the Capitol building. His wrists still ached from the handcuffs. He thought about the cold hood of the car. He thought about Harlan's eyes, the absolute certainty Harlan had that he could abuse a black man in broad daylight and face 0 consequences. "We are not settling," Elias said, his deep voice resolute. "Elias, you have confirmation hearings. The opposition might use a messy civil lawsuit to paint you as an activist judge," Lila warned gently. "I am perfectly fine with that." Elias turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering justice. "Harlan's union representative just abandoned him. He's going to face federal criminal charges for what he did to me. But I am not the first person he has done this to. I am just the first one he couldn't silence." Lila smiled slightly, recognizing the tone. "What do you want to do, Your Honor?" "I want you to file a massive civil rights lawsuit against Trent Harlon and the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department," Elias instructed. "But we are not suing for money. We are suing for records. I want you to subpoena every single arrest report, field interview, and use of force incident Harlan has filed in the last 15 years. Lila's eyes widened. "You're going to audit his entire career." "Exactly," Elias said softly. "Every young man he illegally searched, every piece of evidence he planted, every false report he wrote to cover up his violence. The system protected him because his victims were voiceless. But they have my voice now. We are going to find every single person Trent Harlon has falsely convicted, and we are going to tear his legacy down to the studs." The war room inside the offices of Monroe and Associates was a sprawling masterpiece of organized chaos. Whiteboards lined the glass walls, covered in complex flowcharts connecting dates, names, badge numbers, and court docket files. Boxes of heavily redacted police reports, secured through emergency federal subpoenas, were stacked shoulder-high in the corners. The air smelled of stale coffee, laser printer toner, and the electric hum of a dozen paralegals working around the clock. Lila Monroe stood at the head of the long conference table, her eyes scanning a projected spreadsheet. Elias Voss sat quietly at the opposite end. Despite the fact that his Supreme Court confirmation hearings were scheduled to begin soon, he spent every spare evening in this room. "Harlan didn't just have a pattern, Your Honor," Lila said, dropping a thick manila folder onto the table. "He had a hunting ground. Over the last 15 years, Harlan made 412 arrests. 78% of those were young black men. But here is where it goes from racist policing to a criminal enterprise. In over 200 of those cases, the primary charge was resisting arrest or failure to comply, with no underlying secondary crime." Elias leaned forward, his hands clasped, his face a mask of solemn concentration. He used the badge to initiate the confrontation. When they questioned him, he assaulted them and charged them with resisting. "Exactly." Lila nodded, pulling a photograph from the file and sliding it down the polished wood of the table. "They were mostly kids who couldn't afford private counsel. They were assigned overworked public defenders who looked at Harlan's polished testimony and told their clients to take a plea deal to avoid jail time. But taking a plea meant acquiring a felony record. Harlan ruined lives systematically and deliberately. But this one is the linchpin." Elias picked up the photograph. It was a mugshot of a young man with terrified eyes and a bruised cheekbone. "His name is Callum Drake," Lila explained softly. 5 years ago, Callum was a 19-year-old sophomore at Georgetown University on a full academic scholarship. He was walking home from a study group at midnight. Harlon stopped him, claimed Callum matched the description of a car thief. When Callum asked to call his parents, Harlon beat him with a baton, charged him with assault on a police officer, and threw him in lockup. Elias stared at the young man's bruised face. The echoes of his own arrest rang loudly in his mind. What happened to him? Harlon lied on the stand. He claimed Callum took a swing at him. The jury believed the veteran cop over the scared college kid, Lila said, her voice tightening with anger. Callum was convicted. He lost his scholarship. He was expelled from Georgetown. He served 18 months in a state penitentiary. He works the night shift at a warehouse now, trying to pay off court fees. Elias closed his eyes. The weight of the injustice felt suffocating. He had the power, the money, and the prestige to fight back. Callum Drake had had nothing. I want to meet him, Lila. Bring him here tomorrow. While Elias was unearthing the ghosts of Precinct 2, Trent Harlon was entirely consumed by the nightmare his life had become. Harlon was currently housed in the Alexandria Adult Detention Center under federal hold, segregated from the general population for his own safety. His cell was a 6x8 concrete box. There were no windows to the outside world, only a small slit of reinforced glass looking out into a sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor. For the first few days, Harlon had paced the cell like a caged animal, fueled by a toxic mixture of rage and denial. He yelled at the guards, demanding his phone calls, threatening them with union retaliation, screaming that he was a decorated officer. But as the days turned into a week, the suffocating reality began to crush his chest. No one from the union came. No fellow officers slipped him contraband or offered a sympathetic nod. He was a pariah. The final breaking point occurred when his court-appointed defense attorney, a weary man named Neville Crane, came to visit him in the secure visitation room. Harlon sat behind the plexiglass, his orange jumpsuit hanging loosely over his frame. He had lost weight. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone, replaced by the twitching paranoia of a trapped rat. "Neville, listen to me," Harlon begged, picking up the heavy black telephone receiver. "You have to get me bail. I can't stay in here. The guards look at me like I'm dead meat. I'm a cop. You know what happens to cops in here." Crane sighed, adjusting his glasses. He looked at Harlon, not with malice, but with cold professional detachment. "There is no bail, Trent. The federal magistrate deemed you a flight risk and a danger to the community. But that is the least of your problems." "What do you mean?" Harlon's voice cracked. "Your wife filed for divorce yesterday," Crane said plainly. "She's taking the kids and moving to her sister's house in Ohio. Furthermore, the civil rights lawsuit filed by Judge Voss's legal team has triggered an asset freeze. The bank has frozen your pension, your savings, and the equity on your house pending the outcome of the civil trial." Harlon dropped the receiver from his ear, staring at Crane through the smudged glass. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His chest heaved as a cold, terrifying void opened up beneath him. "Trent, pick up the phone," Crane ordered through the speaker. Slowly, with a trembling hand, Harlon brought the receiver back to his ear. "The Department of Justice is offering a plea deal," Crane continued, his tone flat. "If you plead guilty to the deprivation of civil rights under color of law and the destruction of federal evidence, they will recommend 84 months in federal prison. 7 years. 7 years, Harlon whispered, tears finally spilling over his eyelids, tracking down his unshaven cheeks. "I'll die in there. I'll be killed. You have to fight this. Take it to trial." "If we take it to trial, Trent, they aren't just bringing the Voss tape," Crane warned, leaning closer to the glass. "They have subpoenaed your entire career. The DOJ has reopened 62 of your past arrests. They are going to parade a dozen young men you put in the hospital in front of a federal jury. If you lose at trial, the judge will give you 20 years. Take the 7. It's the only mercy you're going to get." Harlon hung his head, burying his face in his hands, weeping uncontrollably. The badge that had been his shield, his sword, and his entire identity was gone. He was nothing now but a prisoner in the very system he had abused for over a decade. Back at the law firm, Elias Voss sat across from Callum Drake. Callum was 24 now, but he looked much older. His posture was defensive, his eyes guarded. He wore a faded flannel shirt and work boots, sitting awkwardly in the plush leather chair of the conference room. "Mr. Drake," Elias began gently, "I want to thank you for coming in to speak with me." Callum looked at the older man, still grappling with the surreal nature of the meeting. "You're the judge from the news, the one Harlon arrested." "I am." Elias nodded. "Why do you care about me?" Callum asked, his voice laced with years of built-up cynicism and pain. "When I told the judge what Harlon did to me, they laughed. They called me a thug. Now that it happened to a guy in a fancy suit, suddenly everyone cares. It's too late for me. I'm a felon. I sweep floors." Elias did not flinch at the anger. He embraced it, understanding exactly where it came from. "You are absolutely right, Callum. It is a tragedy and a profound failure of the justice system that it took my arrest to shine a light on this precinct. I cannot give you back the 5 years that were stolen from you. I cannot give you back your nights in that cell." Elias leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees, looking directly into Callum's guarded eyes. "But I can promise you this," Elias said, his voice rumbling with quiet intensity. "I am going to tear Trent Harlon's life down to the foundation. And when I am done, I am going to use the full weight of this lawsuit and the Department of Justice to clear your name. We are going to have your conviction vacated. We are going to expunge your record. You are going to get your life back." For the first time in 5 years, the heavy defensive wall behind Callum's eyes cracked. A single tear rolled down his cheek. He looked down at his rough, calloused hands, overwhelmed by the promise of salvation he had long ago stopped praying for. The marble columns of the Hart Senate office building stood as silent sentinels over the packed hearing room. The confirmation hearings for Judge Elias Voss had become the most watched political event of the decade. The room was blindingly bright, illuminated by the massive floodlights of the television networks. Elias sat alone at the witness table, dressed in an immaculate black suit. He looked serene, a man entirely in his element. Behind him sat his family, and just a few rows back, watching intensely, sat Callum Drake, wearing a new suit purchased by Lila Monroe. For 2 days, Elias had masterfully answered complex legal questions regarding antitrust laws, First Amendment jurisprudence, and interstate commerce. He was brilliant, unshakable, and commanded the respect of almost every senator in the room. But politics was a vicious game, and on the 3rd day, the opposition made its move. Senator Briggs Langley, a staunch partisan known for his aggressive questioning, leaned into his microphone. "Judge Voss," Senator Langley began, his tone dripping with skepticism, "I want to talk about your temperament. Recently, you were involved in an altercation with local law enforcement. Since then, you have launched a massive multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit against the police department, effectively crippling their precinct, and you have actively lobbied the DOJ to prosecute the arresting officer. Many of my constituents are asking, if you are confirmed to the highest court in the land, will you be a neutral arbiter of the law, or will you use your seat to pursue personal vendettas against law enforcement?" The room went dead silent. The camera zoomed in tightly on Elias's face. Elias did not show a flash of anger. He did not look defensive. He simply adjusted the microphone in front of him, looking directly at Senator Langley with a gaze that could cut through steel. "Senator Langley," Elias's deep voice resonated through the massive speakers, echoing off the marble walls. A vendetta is an act of personal revenge. Justice is the pursuit of systemic accountability. The officer who arrested me did not just make a procedural error. He violated my Fourth Amendment rights. He committed battery, and he attempted to destroy federal evidence to cover his tracks. Elias paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "But this lawsuit is not about me, Senator," Elias continued, his voice rising in power and clarity. "It is about the 212 individuals, many of whom did not have my resources, my legal education, or my platform, who were brutally victimized by that same officer over a 15-year period, while the system looked the other way. I survived my encounter with that officer because I am a federal judge. But the Constitution does not exist to only protect federal judges. It exists to protect the 19-year-old college student walking home at midnight. It exists to protect the voiceless." Elias gestured slightly toward the gallery behind him without turning around. "If holding a corrupt official accountable for destroying the lives of innocent American citizens is considered a vendetta by your constituents, Senator, then I suggest they re-examine their definition of the rule of law. If I am confirmed to the Supreme Court, my allegiance will be to the Constitution of the United States, and the Constitution demands equal protection under the law, not just for those in tailored suits, but for everyone." The hearing room erupted. Applause, completely against Senate protocol, broke out from the gallery. Even a few senators on the committee could be seen nodding in quiet reverence. Senator Langley sat back in his leather chair, thoroughly defeated, his face flushed red. He had tried to corner a lion, and he had been devoured on national television. 3 weeks later, Elias Voss was confirmed to the United States Supreme Court by a sweeping bipartisan majority. But the final act of the drama did not take place in the Supreme Court building. It took place in a windowless federal courtroom in Alexandria, Virginia. Trent Harlon stood before the bench, wearing the shapeless orange jumpsuit of a federal inmate. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains. He looked broken, a hollow shell of the arrogant bully who had strutted down M Street months earlier. Presiding over the sentencing was Judge Corbin Hale, a stern, no-nonsense jurist who had zero tolerance for police corruption. Harlon had taken the plea deal. The trial had been avoided, but the sentencing phase allowed the judge to hear victim impact statements. For 2 hours, Harlon was forced to stand in his chains and look into the eyes of the young men he had brutalized. He had to listen to mothers cry about how their sons lost their jobs, their freedom, and their dignity because of his lies. Callum Drake had been the last to speak. He did not yell. He just looked Harlon in the eye and said, "You took 5 years of my life because you thought I was nothing. But you're the one in chains today, and I am free." Judge Hale looked down at Harlon from the high bench. "Trent Harlon." Judge Hale's voice was cold and unforgiving. "Law enforcement officers are entrusted with the extraordinary power to deprive citizens of their liberty. It is a sacred trust. You took that trust and you twisted it into a weapon of malice, racism, and ego. You preyed on the vulnerable to inflate your own pathetic sense of authority. And when you finally targeted a man who could fight back, you behaved like a coward, attempting to destroy the evidence of your crimes." Harlon squeezed his eyes shut, tears leaking down his face. "The government has recommended a sentence of 84 months, Judge Hale continued. "I reject that recommendation. I find it vastly insufficient for the decades of generational trauma you have inflicted upon this community." Harlon's eyes snapped open in sheer terror. His attorney Neville Crane turned pale. "Trent Harlon, I sentence you to 144 months, 12 years, in a maximum security federal penitentiary." Judge Hale slammed his gavel down, the crack echoing like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. You will serve every single day of that sentence without the possibility of early parole. Officers, take this disgrace out of my courtroom." Harlon's knees buckled. He collapsed, wailing in despair, his heavy chains rattling loudly against the wooden floor. "No, please, Judge, please! I'll die in there." Two massive federal marshals grabbed Harlon by his armpits, dragging his sobbing, limp body backward down the center aisle of the courtroom. The heavy wooden double doors swung open, swallowing him into the dark hallway, and slammed shut behind him. The monster of Precinct 2 was gone forever. 6 months later, the sun shone brightly over the steps of the United States Supreme Court. Justice Elias Voss stood in his flowing black robes, looking out over the majestic marble plaza. The civil lawsuit had concluded. The D.C. Metropolitan Police Department had been placed under a federal consent decree, forcing sweeping historic reforms in their oversight, training, and use of force protocols. More importantly, the Department of Justice, armed with the evidence uncovered by Lila Monroe, had successfully vacated the convictions of over 150 individuals wrongfully arrested by Harlon. Callum Drake was one of them. With his record expunged and a substantial financial settlement from the city, Callum had re-enrolled at Georgetown University. He was studying pre-law. Elias took a deep breath of the crisp Washington air. He felt the heavy, immense weight of the robes on his shoulders. He knew that the fight for justice was never truly over. There would always be men like Harlon hiding behind badges and gavels, attempting to bend the law to their own prejudice. But as long as there were people willing to stand up, willing to endure the cold steel of the handcuffs to expose the darkness, the scales of justice would ultimately find their balance. Elias turned away from the plaza and walked back into the grand halls of the court, ready to do the work. Justice is not given. It is fought for. The arrogance of one corrupt officer met the unyielding brilliance of a man who refused to be broken, sparking a movement that shattered a system of abuse and freed the innocent. Justice Elias Voss proved that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds the light. If this incredible story of resilience, legal triumph, and the absolute destruction of a bully moved you, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends to spread the message, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life stories.